So we've been talking about Charles Tilly and his book Durable Inequalities, and we've looked at some of the ways that he frames the concept of inequality, and the different sort of mechanisms that he's been using to put that together. We specifically talked about the role of exploitation and opportunity hoarding in the installation of categorical inequality, and the roles of emulation and adaptation to generalize that inequality or categorical inequality influence. But I want to talk about something that is often an issue, I think, with investigations or studies that look at inequality in education or in any field, and that has to do with action. So we often talk about, or we often use the phrase that someone is an actor, meaning that they have a part in what's going on. They are actually doing something that would push an agenda forward or resist an agenda or something like that. And there is a decided, well, bias might be a strong word. Proclivity would be a little less strong of a word towards finding actors and finding agendas in a lot of comparative education work that relates to inequalities. And I think that Tilly's perspective on it is actually an interesting one because he shifts the discussion a little bit. For example, on page 11, he says, people who create or sustain categorical inequality by means of the four basic mechanisms rarely set out to manufacture inequality as such. That is a pretty big statement. So what he's doing here is he's taking the overt actor out of this. He says, instead, they solve other organizational problems by establishing categorically unequal access to valued outcomes. So solve other organizational problems by doing what they do that ends up in categorical inequality or durable inequality. Now this is an important point that he makes because it suggests that rather than there being an inequality-driven agenda, and inequality being the sort of number one focus of what's going on, it's really solving other organizational problems and establishing categorically unequal access or reproducing unequal systems is the most efficient or effective means for solving these other organizational problems, rather than saying, yep, I just want to create inequality. Okay, so when we think about education systems and we think about the way that inequality lives in those education systems, is durable as a result of or because of or through those education systems, then maybe we want to take the perspective of Charles Tilly and say, okay, they do manufacture inequality. That absolutely happens, whether it's through reproducing unequal systems that already exist or actively creating categories of durable inequalities that will be maintained over time, place, and culture. But instead we might say, you know, maybe there's not the star chamber effect. Maybe there isn't a group of people sitting somewhere, you know, wearing ties and business suits, making decisions about how people are going to be kept unequal. Or maybe there's not even an agenda among a dominant group that is coherently or can be coherently labeled as a overt agenda to manufacture inequality. But instead, other organizational problems need to be solved. Often a way to do that is by establishing unequal access to valued outcomes. And so the inequality gets established as a byproduct more than as a primary outcome. If we move forward a little bit to page 52, Tilly says, designed, prescribed, and inherited social structures never quite work as their participants imagine they should or will. People make incessant mistakes, interactions produce unanticipated consequences, and in many circumstances, if everyone actually followed the ostensible rules, either organizational disaster or an utter standstill would result. All right, so this is an interesting point about social processes that create durable inequality. His suggestion is that designed, prescribed, and inherited social structures never work quite as their participants imagine they should or will. What if for our social structure we looked at education? Now, I know it goes a little beyond just a social structure, but it certainly does, education systems certainly do incorporate that. All right, what are education systems designed, prescribed, and inherited to do? All right, we've got knowledge, production, we've got skill development, we've got socialization, we've got political incorporation, in other words, creating citizens. And we could probably list a couple of more. None of these, however, suggest creating inequality. Right? None of these, not knowledge production, skill development, socialization, or political incorporation, have as their primary motive creating inequality. None of the people who establish the policies and procedures and structures of formal education systems worldwide, even when they're coercively doing so, are overtly setting forth an agenda to create inequality. And in fact, if anything, they are overtly setting an agenda to create equality. So, why doesn't it always work that way? Well, because education systems are designed, prescribed, and inherited social systems that never work quite as their participants imagine they should or will. That's a reason. He goes on, remember, people make incessant mistakes, interactions produce unanticipated consequences, and in many circumstances, if everyone actually followed the ostensible rules, either organizational disaster or an utter standstill would result. You have heard me talk on more than one occasion. I'm going to get rid of some of this ink on the slides. You have heard me talk on more than one occasions about some of the different ways that systems change, or that institutions change. Right? They change as a result of coercive forces. Someone forcing someone else, an organization making another do something. Could be with violence or other sort of force. We've talked about mimetic, so copying. I like what they're doing over there, so I think I'd like to do that over here. And then we've got normative. And normative is often the force here that gets the most flack, because critics will say that a normative isomorphism approach suggests that we're pushing towards homogenization or standardization or just one way of doing something. A monoculture effect. When most of the people who talk about normative isomorphism aren't talking about that, they're really talking about there are these systems, as we've talked right here, that never work quite as their participants imagine, and that all of these different things happen over time, and so that the agenda becomes lost or confused. I'm not saying the agenda doesn't still exist. It's still there. But it may not be recognized, or it may be so taken for granted that it doesn't necessarily exist in the same way. And Tilly suggests that that might be possible. He also suggests that coercive mimetic forces are at work as well, right? Why do people make mistakes? Why do interactions produce unanticipated consequences? Why does following the rules not always make sense? Well, because sometimes you are forced to do something else, sometimes you want to do something else because you're copying, and sometimes you just do it because that's the way it's always been done. Okay. I want to take a minute here to focus on this quote. I've gone back a couple of pages. On page 36, you can tell I like the paragraph because I highlighted it. And I'd like to discuss this quite a bit. Why don't we do that in the next video?